Welcome again, everyone. Thank you for joining us. While we're waiting for more people to join in, let me very briefly tell you about the Institute, about the series of events we're doing. And then I will introduce Aseel while more people come in. This is part of the activities of the Institute for Decolonizing Theory. It's a new institute that we have been creating, a few of us. I'm one of the co-founders, if you might say. The idea is decolonizing theory in the sense of focusing on theories of decolonization, but also decolonizing theory itself, taking theory and mobilizing it in an anti-colonial project, but also decolonizing theory from the abstract, from the way academia has turned theory into something that is divorced from practice, whereas we do believe that theory has historically been imbricated with practice, and critical theory was imbricated with revolutionary practice. And hence our name, IDC theory, I don't care theory, because we don't care about theory in the abstract. We only care about theory as something that is transformative, as something that is related to the archive, related to practice, and so on. Which brings us to our interest in the work of Aseel. We're interested in how theory and academia and research can be part of artistic practice, how research can service artistic practice, which is something very intriguing. When I heard about Aseel's work a few months ago, I was very intrigued by this idea of bringing academic research into the exhibition. I haven't been to her exhibitions, but our friend Bandar, who is also with us today, has been to one of them. Thank you, Bandar, for helping me coordinating this. And of course, thank you, Aseel, for joining us. So Aseel AlYaqoub is a research-based and interdisciplinary artist based in Kuwait. She received her master's in fine arts from Pratt Institute, New York, in the year 2015, and received her Bachelor's of Arts from Chelsea College of Art, London, in 2009. Her artistic practice ranges from drawing and printmaking to video, sculpture, and installation, and follows an academic research process that travels across history, architecture, and post-colonial theory. And I hope we will get the chance to talk about that and about Joseph Massad and other post-colonial theorists. She has participated in exhibitions worldwide and recently co-curated the Kuwait Pavilion at the 17th International Architecture Exhibition in Venice in 2021. Aseel, the floor is yours. In the meantime, if anyone has any questions, you can send them to me via the chat, and I'll bring them up in the Q&A. And eventually, we will open up for a Q&A for everyone. So Aseel, thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ahmed, for inviting me and for allowing me to participate in this talk and in your I Don't Care Institute. Let me first see if this works, although we've practiced many times. Okay. Do you see the title screen?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming also to this. I'm very excited to share with you all my research that has been an accumulation of 5 years, but I'll get to that in a bit. So I'll add a little bit onto Ahmed's introduction. So for many years now, I've been exploring the methodologies that Kuwait inherited for nation building. I'm interested in the role of its state apparatuses in defining nationhood and its process of identity making before and after imperial dissolution. And this curiosity comes from a need to fill in gaps of knowledge that exist from being indoctrinated in a British education system for most of my life. So up until 2009, my entire education system was British. And because of that, I knew more about British history, such as the Victorian and Georgian eras, but very little on the layers that formed what is now known as Kuwait, which is where I'm from. So my practice has become somewhat of a decolonizing process for me, where I try to uncover the genealogy or chronology of certain moments in time to either expose or debunk the myths that are surrounding them. So in the past 5 years, I've been analyzing documentation of military demonstrations and graduation ceremonies set in Kuwait and other Arab states via YouTube, social media, and official sources. What I noticed is that the footage recall a history of theater making in the region and is often comical and emits extravagant sets that mimic local architecture. The growing archive that I've managed to accumulate began in 2015 when I received a WhatsApp forward from a friend of the Saudi Arabian forces parading and demonstrating ahead of Hajj. So they have this annual demonstration, I guess in preparation for Hajj, to kind of be like, hey, you know, no terrorists attack here, caution. So the performance stunts of these soldiers range from jumping over racing vehicles to shooting targets, mid-somersault. There's a hostage situation that tends to be the recurring finale of these shows. And the terrorist is always seized effortlessly, like it's a piece of cake. There's always a live audience comprised of ranking officers, members of the ruling family, who are always applauding with pride. And the hypothetical situations that are presented, what I noticed, always seem to be against enemies from within. So the enemy was Arab, and the terrorist usually wears the local costume, maybe some running shoes, and covers his face with a chmaq. So as I'm intrigued by this spectacle, I mean, this is, as an artist, you know, when you see something new that's intriguing, personally, I really dive into it to try to understand what's going on. So in this case, it was a simulation for me of military meets like Pirates of the Caribbean and Disneyland. So I was like, where is this coming from? And I began looking into the timeline of Arabian warfare to get some indication of how these annual rituals took place and why. Like, is this something that's like, I mean, ingrained in us, or what's going on? So I fell upon the Mamluk manuscript of horsemanship. It's a beautiful 14th century Arabic manual. And it's a manual that deals with the care and training of horses, the weapons which horsemen carry, such as the bow, the sword, and the lance. It also shows the assembling of troops and the formation of battle lines. There are like over 25 beautiful miniature paintings that also function as instructive diagrams on the layout of parade grounds, dressage, and various military insignia. So it's like, okay, maybe. But then as I fast forward through time, I come across obviously the Ottoman Empire and the period, and its period basically in history, and found out that 2/3 of the troops that made up this guy, Colonel Mustafa Kemal's 19th Division, were Arab Syrians and other Arabs. And because history has no mercy, and it's for some common knowledge that the Arabs during that time were deprived of their freedom and power for 4 centuries, when they fell under the influence of the Turkish culture, Ottoman Turkish culture, which drained them, oppressed them, and made them a subordinate race, basically. So the soldiers that were in this military were serving sort of their oppressor. Moreover, their public life declined between the Arab world and the Arabs themselves during the Ottoman era. The development of the homeland and the people stopped, and the Arabs within the Ottoman state paid a high price if they were to rebel against this. Not only that, but I find out that it was actually Selim I during the Ottoman Empire that deliberately hindered the progress of the Arab world by specifically bringing down the same Mamluks that I showed you earlier in the 16th century. It's like, okay, well, what about what about like the Arabian Peninsula, for example, or areas of the Arab world that the Ottomans didn't take over? And then I find out that after the First World War, that the Bedouin population of the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula had become a critical resource to be exploited. They weren't exploited by the Ottomans because I think the Ottomans sort of reached their limits and thought that, well, the desert is not important, it's insignificant, and we don't care what happens there. So instead, to fight off the Ottomans, the British employed the Bedouin manpower as military support for its Western operations, because they were also inspired by how they served sheikdoms that were fighting for territories at that time. So as the French and the British began drawing lines on the map, imperialists like Lawrence of Arabia used the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Turks by empowering these irregular forces. And basically what irregular forces to them is basically tribes that have no national ties because there were no nations born out of Arabia yet. And over a short period of time, the very same irregular soldiers became part of the national discourse through a machine of coercion and discipline. The British had particular strategies up their sleeve for non-Western countries to pursue that ensures their armies stay out of politics. So this was something that was very important to them. Some even advocated disciplinary measures that were best achieved not by formulating rules or laws that prohibited the military from interfering in politics, but by producing some sort of a spirit that opposed any form of intervention with it, which they packaged as a new tradition. And that new tradition was basically to make abstention from politics a military tradition. So through various texts, I began realizing that the extension of the military model of Britain and other colonizing nations are very apparent. I mean, I came to the realization that when I was in the Girl Scouts, that when I would do the salute, and the Girl Scouts in general was very much a British product. But at the time when I would salute and say the words of like, I will serve my queen, I genuinely thought that the queen was the queen of the world. And this was post-independence in Kuwait. But in the case of the Arab soldier, the transformation of them is clearly influenced by the imperial forces for many centuries now, and the adoption of the outward image of the European art of warfare, or the imperial art of war, was part of their primary agenda. In Murley's book, British Military Skeptical, the first chapter opens as follows, and I find this quite funny. In 1871, a new recruit in the British Army asked his mates, "Is this a fighting machine or a blinking circus?" The group voted unanimously for the circus. This is a remarkable statement considering the British Army fought extensively in the 19th century in an almost uninterrupted series of campaigns to conquer a quarter of the world. An apparent contradiction occurs when soldiers highlight the importance of fancy uniforms and display over the fundamental task of wielding armed force. It may be due to the manipulation of the military spectacle, whereby the dress, which consisted of colorful clothing, elaborate headgear, flashy equipment, and regimental distinctions, played a major role. These elements, combined with flags, music, and weapons, were displayed through coordinated formations of men, animals, and equipment. Thus, ceremonies and rituals, including parades, reviews, daily exercises, drills, and other formalities, have become an essential component of military life to manage the deadly military machine. The appeal of the military model spread the Army's values throughout British society, as well as societies throughout British colonies, to promote and advertise the adoption of military virtues beyond the military subculture. So the British control of martial imagery aimed to put a personal and artistic stamp on the appearance of soldiers to uphold the dignity of both their monarchy and army at home or abroad. Further, the upkeep of the dress and equipment and the ways in which they were worn at very high standards required constant labor and attention from the soldier, and the purpose of such demands maintained and strengthened this form of discipline through the production of powerful psychological effects imposed on the recruits. So it was less about how to teach them how to fight and more about how they should look like when they fight. So the clothing was seen as a very non-superficial matter, and it became an important hybrid concept. At the basic level, hybridity refers to any mixing of East and Western culture, sort of like in science, like a cross-pollination. But within colonial and post-colonial literature, it most commonly refers to colonial subjects from Asia or Africa, who have found a balance between Eastern and Western cultural attributes. But this balance was not meant to be striven for. It was imposed by the colonizer according to what they deemed fit. So to independently strive for cultural hybridity, like if you feel like you wanted to create a balance between the East and the West based on your own accord, for example, an Indian who visits London wearing a suit back in the old days was very much looked down upon and maybe even considered offensive by the British or for the British. So it was only allowed if it was prescribed. I wanted to explore the hybridity that seemed prevalent in a lot of the content from my research, not only in the way that the soldiers dressed, but also performed. I wanted to see whether this hybridity or cultural mixing can be differentiated between people who consciously strive to achieve a mixed identity and between those who accidentally reflect it. Like, is it intentional, or is there this weird mirroring that's happening that these institutions are not aware of? According to Joseph Masad, British policies not only repressed and erased much in the Arabs' way of life that conflicted with imperial interests, but also produced much that was new and combined it with what was inoffensive and beneficial in their tradition, and what they called a combination between our traditions, which we want to give you, versus your traditions in combination with your traditions that we like. And then that was packaged as real Arab culture. And to enforce the concept of the nation state onto the region, the Bedouin tribes specifically needed to be pacified and integrated institutionally somehow, because how do you describe to groups of people that could travel across regions freely, that now there was this concept of the nation state and borders? Also, that the British needed to control the desert, specifically in Jordan, and who better to assign the task than John Bagot Glubb, who was a British officer who excelled in neighboring Iraq, to control the Bedouin tribes there through legal strictures and military conscription, where the latter being the preferred method to integrate them within the fold of the nation state. So here's John Glubb, also known as Glubb Pasha, who was the chief of the Arab Legion in Jordan from 1939. He set out to establish a new force within the Arab Legion, which he called Desert Patrol or Kuwait al-Badiyah, wherein he recruited its members solely from among the Bedouins. Glubb disliked town Arabs and considered them racial hybrids, and this type of hybridity he did not approve of, compared with the racially pure and martial Bedouins and villagers. And this tactic is not unique. It's part of a generalized British imperial policy, also known as divide and conquer, which was practiced elsewhere within the empire to divide a group of people based on race or class or ethnicity. So Glubb was committed to colorful exhibitionism. He knew exactly what the new Arab soldier should look like, what he should wear, how he should move, what he should know, what he should view as tradition and culture, what he should accept as suitable modernity, but above all, whom he should consider friend or foe. For him, Arab clothing seems to him much more suitable to Arabia than European clothing. So cultural cross-dressing became the new corporal culture for the Desert Patrol, but also a fetishized commodity. It wasn't cultural cross-dressing in the sense that they would wear some kind of colonial-inspired uniform. He also appropriated the costume and dressed up like the Desert Patrol. In his autobiography, he goes into immense detail on the elements used to form the new uniform, and was proud of one particular design, which was the red and white checkered headcloth that later became a kind of Arab nationalist symbol. This was to replace the black and white hatta associated to Palestinians to dissociate them from the new Jordanian national image. Also perceived as feminine, Glubb gradually altered the Bedouin by slowly cutting their hair or their braids and removing their eyeliner, which they used as sunscreen. And when it was time for battle, the new gear was issued. The Bedouin soldiers were used to wearing open sandals, which meant their feet, according to the British, were unusually wide. British Army boots were often an agony to them. So with their daggers, they cut off the toe caps and made holes on the side to let the air in. So they turned it into a sandal, basically, as a compromise, probably. They found it difficult to understand why the British frowned upon this, and it took them weeks to get them to turn out into the new kit with their equipment properly and neatly in place like the British wanted. Following the period from 1941 to 1943, the dress of all fighting units were changed to European clothing, as it was seen as more appropriate for battle conditions. The change of clothing was also affected for economic reasons because Globe's elaborate designs, which were also very Victorian, were quite costly. However, the Bedouin military police units continue to wear Globe's original designs to this day in Jordan, along with the rest of the Desert Patrol. Unlike Lawrence, who presented himself as a spectacle, Globe was not necessarily part of the military spectacle that the Bedouins constituted. He remained outside of the spectacle because he was too busy directing it. His course of selective westernization is what Globe set out to accomplish by teaching the Bedouins how to mimic certain, but not all things Western. In this parade, we witness the essence of the new Arab soldier, not so much whom to fight and how to fight, but just as importantly, whom and what to protect and how, and what to wear while doing so. The new Arab soldier came to possess a new story, a new epistemology, and his body was trained, fed, treated, educated, and dressed. This new military man was to become the icon and the symbol of the emergent Arab nation. His body was to become the national body. Globe turned the men into exhibition pieces onto the rest of the world to display order presumed lacking in Arab states. The Arab soldier produced became but a faint copy of an original that does not exist, a spectacle to himself and others, although it is nationally constitutive. The spectacle's appearance and the individual's own gestures are no longer their own, but rather those of someone who represents them to him. As I continued watching this video published by British Pathé of the Arab Legion's Parade in 1954, I spotted Sheikh Abdullah Salim, who was the ruler of Kuwait at the time, alongside the young King Hussein and John Globe. Many Arab delegates witnessed Globe's designs at this event and then later appropriated them soon after King Hussein fired Globe in 1956, a year after the Second Arab-Israeli War began. So it may be that after this parade, there was some form of Arab unity or inspiration, something was inspired from it that no longer needed the British. And they began to fend for themselves, can be able to fend for themselves now. But nevertheless, Globe's elements were packaged and presented to Kuwait's ruling elite, as well as other countries, as authentic culture, transmitted onto society through various mechanisms such as media, official propaganda, conscription, and music. The most important musical instruments to be introduced to the Legion were the bagpipes. So that was then also imported to Kuwait. And yes, we have like the Habban, which is like the Farsi equivalent of that, but this is specifically Scottish bagpipes. So people abroad who witnessed this, who imagined Arabs to be wild desert camel riders, were surprised to see their military bands using pipes and drums, which for them turned them into modern men. There are other examples like Globe, such as Hugh Bousted, who was the commander of the Sudan Camel Corps, and also served as a diplomat in several Middle Eastern countries, including Yemen and Oman, eventually settling down in the UAE. In Saudi Arabia, the British began efforts to try to build a professional force, but after failure of this program, a subsequent US program, which ran from 1951, also failed to reach its objective due to internal Saudi power struggles and geopolitical concerns. So coups were like super trending back then, and they were happening everywhere through anti-colonial protests. So the army's growth remained stagnant for a while, but nevertheless, the appropriated hybridity is evident in the clothing and presentation of its national forces. Post-colonial critical theorist Ami K. Baba refers to such institutional appropriations as colonial mimicry. He says, for mimicry to be effective, it must always produce its slippage, excess, difference. However, the side effects of colonial mimicry may have long-lasting effects beyond recall. When human culture transforms into a habit, the origins of a specific behavior or hierarchical prescription is usually forgotten over time, and as a result, the habit transformed into an ingrained and rigid custom. Although by appropriating colonial discourse, anti-colonial nationalism was able to subvert it and resist it. So by appropriating these institutions, it managed to end colonial rule. But its subsequent refusal, however, to question colonial modes of governance and the very prescriptions of colonial influence meant it has to rethink entire institutions and various political and societal frameworks all over again. So rather than saying, okay, we'll use anti-colonial nationalism and take what you taught us to fight you, we also mistook that new type of nationalism for an absolute essence. It's secured, it's done, it's our tradition. So at the end of the day, this is proof of colonial's perpetual victory over the colonizers. On the right, you have the British Army wearing leopard skins, which are a symbol of their colonial empire of being able to take over Africa and India and bringing back these leopard skins. And then on the right, you have the Kuwaiti marching band wearing the same very costume, although they have their histories are very, very far apart. So the irony of having this is in having me believe that this comes from our own agency. And as Frantz Fanon has shown, once national independence is achieved, the new nation-state elites replace their colonial masters by administrating the same institutions that were used to control them. For this reason, I attended the annual graduation at the Kuwait Military Academy to document if there was any kind of colonial mimicry still prevalent in martial performances. Over half a century has passed since Kuwait's independence from the British in 1961, but the public manifestation of the military spectacle, although admittedly entertaining, still brims with many contradictions. So upon entering the stadium, I was welcomed by the fanfare music of the martial band that favored European musical instruments such as bagpipes and trumpets. They even played Yankee Doodle Went to Town. And all at once, I witnessed the birth of a cloned species of newly bred soldiers born out of a military machine, constructed as isolated, disciplined, receptive, and industrious political subjects. Their pride, which is a dangerous human attribute in my opinion, was the strong factor that defended their self-esteem, but also controlled their sensibilities and perception. Pride was further conjured by the audience that consisted of family members, high-ranking officials, and members of the ruling family. That pride was like magic, I have to admit, as I became quickly consumed by it. Through the lens, I observed the martial band, who consisted mainly of Bengali musicians. Heavily suffused with symbols and ideologies of nationalism, the military is meant to be the most important homosocial nationalist institution within the confines of the nation state. Yet some jobs, even in the most important institutions, seem beneath the new national body that it produces, and the same modes of transformation used by the British are imposed on the other. At the military spectacle, I had become temporarily and unwittingly involved in a custom practiced by a subcultural group. It's not an everyday thing that we get to see this on TV. It's televised, but it's not a thing, you know? So being a part of this was an extremely new experience for me. And the elaborate, consciously performed and consciously symbolic norms of this military machine seem to have united us, although I don't have any relatives that are down there like everyone else, but it united us under one nation, one culture, one religion, one political ideology. But to me, I had to remember that the show is just an ironic combination of nation and empire in which nostalgia was a clinging and defining condition. So Kuwait's military spectacle exposed the historical contingency of nationhood, replaying embodied nationalisms annually, marking them as real over and over again, as proven in the process of this annual reenactment. Hierarchy in Kuwait is best illustrated in its national creed that contributes to the nation's idealistic philosophy. So in Kuwait, it's God, the nation, the prince, Allah al-Watan Amir, which is the decree of the Kuwait's military, And this division appeals to the soldier's spiritual pride, but also determines the hierarchy. And this remarkably assertive hierarchy is central to Kuwait's social understandings of good values. So subsequently dividing through the military into a rigid chain of commands. And what's also interesting is that in this image, you'll see it's a line from Yusuf Shati's poem, and it says, إننا في الحرب سيوفا وقنا, which someone can correct me if I'm wrong later, because there was a lot of debate around this, translates into, we are at war, a sword and a spear. And this is facing the very same martial band that uses, so Arabic poetry against Yankee Doodle went to town music. So I found that pretty interesting. At the end of the ceremony, I witnessed how both institution and soldier continue to repeat rather than represent. So it almost felt like it was a way of pretending to be real, to exist, to be learning, when in actuality, they are mimicking. So a considerable amount of time and effort and money had been invested in maintaining a yearly show to solidify the military, but it solidified it to me more like a theatrical institution. And through its visual and cultural dimensions, the evolution or the origin of Kuwait's military is veiled by the whole dramatic effect of this show. The theater of power expressed was so scripted to a protocol and so hierarchically arranged that it was obviously, for me, performed for its own sake. So the red and white shmaq was pretty prevalent, as well as other colonial elements such as uniforms, routines, and instruments. And they're all juxtaposed against selected local traditions that were deemed fit. As a result, a national culture formed through the military, to me, seemed not so much traditional, but traditionalized. And because Glab designed the red and white shmaq, for me, I began to question why the Kuwaiti national identity and its national culture keeps thinking of itself in essentialist terms. Like other post-colonial national identities, Kuwait national identity and national culture are products and effects clearly of colonial institutions. I mean, one of the things that I had to encounter when explaining this piece, which is basically I took a red and white shmaq and I created a celebratory garland like you saw in the previous image, and attached to it a found antique object, which is the first emblem of the Kuwait's military post-independence. And I called it Congratulations. And I wanted to expose any misconceptions that surround this commonly worn article of clothing, which sparked a few debates. One being that that's not true. The club didn't design the red and white shmaq, because Sheikh Mbarak Kabir, who was the first ruler of Kuwait, wore it, but all of his pictures are in black and white, so it's really hard to actually make that assessment. And then Glab is very clear and proud of his accomplishments. So that was actually very interesting to showcase in the exhibition, because a lot of people were shocked by this information, as was I when I discovered it. So in my archives, there's like hundreds of videos highlighting annual performances from around the Arab world, but specifically from Kuwait. The spectacle here involves multiple performances such as abseiling, free-falling, routines, and target shooting. It's very similar. It's less of a parade and sort of like a spectacle, and more of like a demonstration similar to the Saudi video that I showed in my first slide. But one of the most prominent acts in this theater as well is also the hostage situation, which also here, the enemy or terrorist seems to be Arab or Muslim, always stemming from within. However, since the inception of this theater, these invented traditions as well as the architecture have had little to no change, as is proven in today's annual reenactments. So you can see there in the 70s, it's basically the same concept. And it seems as though that the choreography and these sets were sacred, like nothing should change or develop or progress. And so to better understand the importance of these rituals and these contexts, I began a series of axonometric drawings that depict the setting where the graduation performances of Kuwait's special forces took place. And I began imagining what happens inside these sets with whatever cues I could receive from the soldiers' movements or from like explosions and things like that. Then through an intimate performance between me and myself, basically, I just sat and did a drawing performance that required several rehearsals myself. So just like the soldiers, I rehearsed these drawings, and then the final drawings were drawn once on precious paper. And considering that both the institution and the soldier continue to repeat rather than recreate or develop, there will always be subtle and sometimes obvious miscalculations or maladaptations in their performances, whether they miss the target, whether they trip, whether they lose a shoe. And these miscalculations were made visible in my drawings through the act of drawing and the routine itself. And so my mistakes, I just accepted them. The series highlights how the military institution aims to construct these isolated, disciplined, and receptive subjects out of modern individuals, but they end up leading to maladaptation. So is there a real evolutionary process here? So I'm zooming in here because this was one of my favorite scenes in this, because here you could actually really see the maladaptations. When they missed the target, I could actually literally count, and in this drawing, some of the lines missed the pots and hit the wall, so it was easy to see. And I became very drawn towards the clay pot vessels that were used in these target demonstrations. I wondered, why pots? Is there some kind of like significance to what I was talking about earlier? Is this like an East meets West thing, or is this like a global thing where like it's meant to be functional and deliberate in the way in which these target practices or demonstrations are done? But other than clay pigeon shooting, I couldn't find any other country that did this other than regionally. So Iran, Jordan, and other Arab states. So I wanted to understand like the history of target shooting, understand what the vessel represented, and found out most targets used in shooting sports today are abstract figures, of which their origins often are not given much thought. But given the military and hunting origins that started most shooting disciplines, it is not hard to understand that many of the targets at some point originally resembled either a human or an animal, whether it's a human opponent or an animal for a hunting situation. So for instance, the well-known circular bullseye target might originally have resembled a human torso or an animal being hunted. So the clay pots for me became a metaphor for our preserving function as humans, which under national conditions is fulfilled by fights against our own species. So the pots end up representing other soldiers or the soldiers themselves. And although we as humans have mastered all hostile powers in our environments, we are still our own biggest threat. Now, we've reached the stage of having weapons, clothing, and social organization. We've overcome the dangers of starving, freezing, and being eaten by wild animals. And these dangers cease to be the essential factors influencing us. However, something evil must have set in. And the factor influencing us now is the wars waged between hostile neighboring tribes. And by tribes, I mean anything, like countries, neighboring actual neighborhoods. So these must have evolved into an extreme form of, the soldiers had to evolve some extreme form of so-called warrior virtues, which unfortunately many people still regard as desirable ideals. So Dodging Bullets is a series of blown glass vessels that mimic clay pots that are used for target training, but also questions whether these soldiers are genuinely aware of the colonizing process that had provided them with this new disciplinary power and these warrior virtues. So the concept lies in the process of inflating scorching molten glass with a blowpipe to form a bubble that needs to be quickly manipulated into the desired shape. So the series references the narrow window of time in which men are molded into soldiers, strapped between imagination and reality through their materiality, but also they are trying to be something they're not. through that very same materiality. Instead of clay, they are glass and if anything, more fragile. So as Kuwait was formed under pressure conditions, similarly to how glass is made or these pots were made, our systems of historically developed social norms and rights passed down from generation to generation have been replaced with supposedly higher values for which to live and if necessary to die for. So we are evolving in some cultural ritualization that has been handed down by someone or something that is perceived as higher or authoritative. Now, to kill a culture, it's often sufficient to bring it into contact with another, just to bring it into contact, particularly if the latter is higher, or at least regarded as higher, as the culture of a conquering nation usually is. The people of the subdued side then tend to look down on everything perceived previously held sacred and to ape the customs which they regard as superior. Colonial history offers abundant examples of its causing the destruction not only of cultures but also of peoples and races. And even in the less tragic case of rather closely related and roughly equivalent cultures, cultural mixing, there usually are some undesirable results because each finds it easier to imitate the most superficial and the least valuable customs of the other. So rather than deciding on getting the customs that are important or valuable, it's like what's the easiest one, which is the least valuable generally. National culture, on the other hand, is produced by the nation state and its people, whereby traditional culture carried from the past is combined with the nation's projects of modernization. Through tradition and modernity, the nation simultaneously lives its traditional past, its present emergence, and its future modernity as one mediated moment. National identity is then born out of national culture, and it carries a set of characteristics and markers such as territorial and ancestral origins, religion, race, gender, class, and language. But how can, one of the questions I was asking was, how can national culture be formed in protectorate states, such as Yemen and Kuwait? And such states have a form of protection where the country, like Kuwait, continues to retain an international personality and enjoys an agreed amount of independence in conducting its foreign policy. But for political and pragmatic reasons, the protection relationship is not usually advertised. So like the people don't know it's really what a protectorate means. The rest of the world doesn't. It's usually described with euphemisms such as an independent state with a special treaty relations. So we have special treaty relations with Britain to protect us. So the states like Kuwait appear on world maps just as any other independent state, but they remain perpetually dependent on their protector. This is because it was of the interest of imperialists to maintain the protectorate's dependency under the guise of support. Not only that, but it convinced them of a binary system whereby the inner, outer, the modern, traditional, the male-female distinctions were divided into the public and private realms. So through lawmaking, modernity and modern European codes could be formally judged on issues of statecraft in the economy, like civil law, etc. So the British did have some jurisdiction over some laws, but it avoided the religious and local traditions or rules, especially matters that revolved around sexuality, family relations, and culture. So you deal with that, we'll deal with sort of like the stuff that we're here to teach you, but also to kind of take over in some extent. So after its independence, Kuwait adopted this colonial states model, which ultimately represses existing cultural practices that are an antithesis of its own. So if Kuwait now takes this colonial appropriation of the binary system, it's going to continue to maintain it, but now you have like maybe the state that's taken over the British side, and then who are the people that are, what people, because we were all the people before, and now it's like, which people are going to manage the rest of the stuff that are usually considered revolving around morals. So the state does this while it produces new national images for the people, such as flags, music and clothing, to say like, this is your new national identity, but we're still maintaining some old stuff. And perhaps one of the most catastrophic binary systems perpetuated by imperialism is the invention of the concept of race. So, for example, the simple opposition of like black, brown, yellow, white is in fact a strategy to establish a binarism of white, non-white, which asserts this relation of dominance. So the binary constructs a scandalous category between the two terms that will be the domain of taboo, but equally importantly, the structure can be read downwards as well as across, so that the colonizer is white, human, and beautiful, and they're collectively opposed to colonized black, bestial, and ugly. In most modern states, the structure and organization of power produces a gendered set of nationalist agents that rely on conventional masculine characteristics that banish from its rank feminine attributes of physical frailty, weakness, and fragility. Kuwait's military institution underscores these binary qualities of male-female by excluding women from its service. So the binary persists as it was prescribed. In the Arab world, national identity was the site of negotiating not only East and West as conceptual anchors, but also gendered citizenship. So the responsibilities of men and women to the nation emerged as cornerstones of nation building in the colonized world, just as they had and continue to be in European countries. For nationalism to achieve its dual or binary goals, it divides the world into two domains, the material and the spiritual. So as Arabs, we succumb to the material, which is the domain of the outside, it's the outer, because that involves economy and statecraft, science and technology, and the West are much better at doing that than we are. So as a result, it needed to negate and preserve its spiritual culture, which was the inner ours, whether it's religion or any other form of culture. So this piece, Post-War Domestic Bliss, epitomizes these remarkably assertive principles as central to Kuwait's social understanding of good values. Women should not have warrior virtues and thus should not be able to wield a weapon. Muslim women should remain in the home, or there's certain rules and restrictions when she enters public life, as women cannot mix with men unrelated to them and should not adorn themselves in public, and wearing a uniform or wielding a weapon is a form of adornment. So imperialists like Glove knew that the Druid, or believed actually, that this type of ruling system was unacceptable by Arabs in the way that they portrayed it onto them, because Arabs apparently to him prefer to follow men and not machines. So it's like the jurisdictional aspect we will manage. That's why, because the Arabs can't do it. They hate bureaucracy, although they're, according to him, they're the most outspoken and democratic of races. But he knew that the imposing of Western standards of morality, so what the West perceived as fine, not fine, would likely provoke opposition in the domain of taboo, an area of where ambivalence, hybridity, and complexity could disrupt imperial logic. So the male-female binary falls under the scandalous category, which further asserts this relationship of distinction and dominance that's been continuing since then. So as more women join in the military service across the Arab world, Kuwait seems more focused on returning to an authentic Islamic Islamic culture as a response to the attempts that aim to replace Arab culture, or what they perceive as Arab culture, with liberal Western views. Through this process, the binary system persists through the words modern versus traditional, whereby being modern continues to mimic the West and tradition is steered autonomously. But my question is whose tradition? Like there's a huge variety and diversity of traditions in Kuwait. Not every part of Kuwait practices the same traditions. So whose traditions are we following here? And although many women fought and died in the 1990 Gulf War, women in the military still remains taboo. Unlike many nations that build their military to threaten or save other countries, Kuwait feels compelled to uphold one for the primary purpose of defense. Geopolitically, as was proven during the 1990 Gulf War, the small state remains subdued by its more powerful neighbors and continues to be dependent on foreign ally forces. And although it has acquired an impressive collection of land power and artillery and air power, such as fighter jets, helicopters, tanks, armored vehicles, only like 15 to 20,000 men are active personnel in the military today. So these warrior virtues are very, very important in preserving Kuwait's precarious sovereignty, lest it be devoured by unforeseeable circumstances. And here I can see how these colonial institutions, or the idea of dependency, allows a form of imprinting to emerge on these nation states that were under colonial influence. And this process is evident in Kuwait's attachment to its foster mother, which is Britain. Imprinting is generally credited to ethologist Conrad Lorenz, who experimented with this phenomenon using the hatchings of a mallet. So he took from a duck a bunch of eggs, split them in half, kept half of them with her, and took the other half with him. And he discovered that he could serve as an adequate parent for these ducklings when they were hatched. So to test if his theory is actually true, because what it did is it elicited a following response. So wherever he walked, these ducklings would follow him, they would respond to him. Because I'm going to take these ducklings and I'll put them in a box with this ducklings, with the siblings, mix them up, dump them out, and see who goes where. And it worked. They followed him, and the other half followed their mother, because they basically transferred onto him through visual and auditory stimulus that he kept performing in front of them, which then elicited the following response. So, but then he also concludes that the early stages of a duckling's life are critical, and that the process of imprinting was sometimes permanent and irreversible. So if we conceptually analyze imprinting through a colonial lens, post-colonial processes seem to exhibit similar results where techniques of governance are concerned. In Kuwait, there's almost a complete colonial institutional continuity. Upon signing the Protectorate Agreement in 1899, Kuwait had commenced a critical moment in its history and possibly used environmental clues to both identify and attach itself to its protector. However, the protector replaced and even erased much of what existed that was in conflict with their imperial interests. And Kuwait, through its visual culture to propagate nationalism, appropriated the same tools, language, and cues used by the British Empire. I mean, the national symbols of England are things which are emblematic, representative of otherwise characteristic of England or English culture. Some are established official symbols, for example, the Royal Arms of England, which has been codified in heraldry. Other symbols may not have official status for one reason or another, but are likewise recognized as national or international level. The royal cipher symbols were used across its colonies, though, which may have influenced the design of Kuwait's coat of arms and other various emblems after its independence. However, the crown is not born out of our culture or any historical reference, but inherited and directly linked to colonial symbolism. What's interesting is that whenever Kuwait has any official diplomatic meetings, the crown insignia, which is very similar to the Queen's crown, or now the King's crown, is always made visible. So, okay. Speaking of our flag, I thought I missed a slide. Speaking of our flag, it's not known who designed our national flag, other than it magically appeared in 1961, the year of independence. And it follows the same visual tropes as Mark Sykes' designs, which include the Arab Revolt flag that later became the basis for many Arab flags. In the process of waiting during the Gulf War in 1990, the London-based Citizens for a Free Kuwait movement began a series of campaigns and peaceful protests to rally Kuwait's allies. The committee employed several British citizens as consultants and executives, including Kuwaitis, and hired public relations firms to produce various items such as caps and coffee cups. In addition, many posters were printed to support the ousting of Saddam's occupation from Kuwait, such as Abd Mohsen Hussein Shishtar's design that depicted scenes of Kuwaitis protesting in London behind large text that reads, "Kuwait says no to invaders." It's beautifully designed by the folding and looping of the national flag, and the no is positioned here as a national icon of protest. Throughout my process and the development of each work, the snow became like inevitably became my conclusive statement. It was like, I just found it really powerful to use this flag that was probably not designed by us, probably designed by Mark Sykes or inspired by Mike Sykes, and was used as a national icon of protest in the Gulf War, to poke at the institution's refusal to question colonial modes of governance, which inevitably ends up enforcing colonialism's victory. And I presented the work at the Sultan Gallery in Kuwait, entitled Graduation Ceremony, in hopes of unveiling the evolutionary or lack of evolutionary origin, or more like where it stemmed from, of Kuwait's military as an appropriated apparatus. And through various mediums, Kuwait's theater of power, scripted protocols, and hierarchical arrangements are brought together to examine whether such colonial principles perceived as absolute essences are worthy of adherence. The works were presented similarly to the graduation ceremonies that I had been consumed with for so many years, and I arranged everything as though you were entering a looping obstacle course, with nods at setups used for target demonstrations that were pulled out from the drawings that I had performed, to actual pieces of walls from the theatrical sets used in hostage rehearsals to reiterate other pieces, and the boards that were used to sort of, they used to do the karate chops on them in these performances, and I felt necessary to use them. So in addition to the work I presented to you today, the research was formed into a chronology as a classroom video. And I call it a classroom video because I wanted to give it this very educational vibe. And I used found footage to delve into the Arab military genealogy that includes films, science experiments, and pop cultural shows. And the essay was performed by, rather than by myself, I used two artificial intelligence narrators, Logan and Thomas, who recited in a British accent that was very similar to the style of the British Pathé newsreels and documentaries that I had seen. And Logan actually sounds a lot like David Attenborough. So remarkably, much of the audience who came and were watching the film were intrigued by who this man was, why there was a documentary about our military's vis-a-vis ducks and other birds, and where and if they could find this online. And many lost interest when I informed them that it's my own words as a video essay, which was the actual reason why I used a generated voice, because I was wondering whether I needed to expose our conditioning that we still seek knowledge from the West rather than through the words of our own. But yeah, I don't present solutions, only questions in this exhibition. But considering the military model will persist as central to the structure and organization of power in all modern states, the weak ones like Kuwait are forced to tolerate it. But my only hope is that we can do so without continuously administrating the same institutions that were used to control us and mistaking them for values or constructions that have responsible principles worthy of loyalty and obedience. Thank you.